Hi everyone and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here and today I'll be painting this dramatic stormy seascape for you. I'm beginning with a piece of Milford brand cold press watercolour paper, size a quarter imperial or 28 by 38 centimeters. I've got it taped onto my board using masking tape, and my board is set at an angle of roughly 45 degrees. As you can see from the water running down the paper here, this is just to help get a really nice flow of colour when I begin adding the paint. But my first step is adding a wash of clean, fresh water over the top 2/3 of the paper so we can begin the sky. I'm starting with some raw sienna to give a lovely golden glow to the background of our stormy sky, so perhaps the hint of a little bit of sunlight peeping through those heavy storm clouds that I'm about to put in. For this I'm using a lovely dark rich mixture of paint. I'm using Payne's Grey, Ultramarine Blue, Van Dyke Brown and some indigo as well. As you can see, I'm using my large mop brush to simply sweep the paint around the board at the moment. We've got plenty of water on there, so it's moving really nicely. You can see it's already starting to run and trickle down and starting to create its own lovely patterns. I'm adding some heavier colour here in the top left corner using thicker paint because that's the direction I want my storm clouds to be blowing in from. So again, I'm using a mixture of Van Dyke Brown, a little indigo, a little ultramarine and some Payne's Grey. And now to get a really great moody sky, I'm going to move my board around, tipping and tilting, because I've got so much water on my paper at the moment. The paint is going to move of its own accord with the water because I've got my board at an angle. It's going to create these beautiful directional shapes and patterns really naturally that I wouldn't be able to create using a paintbrush. So half the trick here is just letting the water do the work. And you can see here right at the top that the dark colour is threading its way through the water. Just remove that so you can see a little more. We're getting these lovely lines and rivulets of dark colour moving across the sky quite naturally and quite independently of anything that I'm doing. Save for putting an extra little bit of indigo right up in this top corner to just help boost up that dark cloud colour. As you can see, it's all about just finding the angle that works for you and just watching the paint, watching how it moves and simply moving your board around freely. You can see here, I've just shown you how much of a shine there is on the paper. You can see how much water there still is and how freely the paint is moving. We're getting a lovely diffusion of colour. You can barely see there's any sort of hard edges of my brush strokes anymore. Which is the whole point of this, is to get a lovely dramatic sky without too many hard edges and to get it really simply and easily. And here I'm just using a clean brush to simply straighten out my horizon line and get it ready to loosely paint in our sea below. So as you can see, I've got the painting upside down at the moment. This is just allowing the paint to run back and build up at the lower area, which is technically the top, to help build up these cloud shapes. It's also because I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing, and I find it easier to dry brush the top of the paper rather than the bottom, something presumably to do with the angle of the way that I'm sitting. This is just my personal preference and an easy way for me to do a nice little light bit of dry brush to get that sparkling sea in nice and quickly. And there we go, you can see I've got that ready. I am going to put some darks into the sea, and you'll see here I'm just going to use my mop brush to stuff in some really nice moody lines loosely into the water, just to start building up a pattern of dark colour to reflect that dark stormy cloud up above. Now I'm not looking to fully finish off the sea here because I want to get back to that style whilst that paint's still really wet. But while I've still got the same sky colour on my brush, I'm just roughing in these dark shapes to build up a base of colour. But I'm making sure to keep plenty of the white paper, the dry brush, peeping through. That's going to be our like rough, choppy, stormy water. And I'm using a thin brush to just add these sort of loose, scratchy marks across part of the water as well, to just add an extra little bit of detail and texture, that sense of rough, choppy water going this way, that way, blown by the wind. Now, while the sky is still wet, I'm going to put in some cloud. This dark patch here was starting to belly out and come a little bit low for my personal preference. So I'm beginning here, and I'm using a clean damp brush. You can see I'm wiping it off here on some tissue and just using it to pull some colour out of the sky. You can see I'm using sort of really loose textural brush strokes to get some interesting shapes, sort of really rough edges of a big old cloud formation, this lovely fluffy white cloud coming in advance of this very, very dark sky. We want it to look really, really dramatic. And you can see, because this sky is still quite wet, it's nowhere near as wet as when we started, but it is still wet paint on the paper, and you can see it's lifting really nicely. We're getting back to some nice pale paper underneath this dark colour. I'm using the flat brush because it gives me a decent amount of control here, and as you could see earlier, I was sort of twisting it around, and you can create these really interesting shapes and textures with the flat by sort of moving it and twisting it quite organically across the paper. It's also a great brush for lifting because it's got quite stiff bristles. You don't want too soft a brush for this because it won't give you the pressure that you need to properly lift the paint cleanly off the paper, or at least that's what I find. I do find a good synthetic flat brush to be one of the very best brushes for lifting out paint in this fashion, be it for clouds or reflections or anything else that you might need. The type of paper that you're using as well does help. I'm using Milford brand cotton paper, which is a really, really wonderful one for lifting out. As you can see, I'm having to put very little effort in here and getting these lovely clean white lines showing through. And at this point, you can just simply keep going until you're happy with the shape of your cloud. You're happy that it looks dramatic enough against this heavy, stormy backdrop. I'm happy with my cloud here, so I'm going to set it aside and leave it to dry. And this now is what it looks like. It's fully dry now. I'm really happy with how it looks, so it's ready for my next step. So now it's time to finish off that rough sea by adding in a little extra colour. So you can see I'm using my flat brush again, and I've watered down some paint. This is Payne's Grey mixed with indigo. You can see it's a lot lighter, a lot more heavily watered down than the paint I was using before. And again, I'm just coming in and beginning to slowly build up a little bit of colour using these loose directional strokes. For the most part, I'm using horizontal lines to capture that sense of the sea and its waves being blown by a strong directional wind, but also I am putting in these rough diagonals coming across the centre here. This is just going to add an extra little bit of texture and movement into our water. And my focus is also not to take away too much of that lovely light dry brush that I was able to put in to begin with, because again that's giving us that sense of lovely choppy white water, these lovely waves rolling in right from the distant horizon towards us. So I'm just putting a little bit of loose colour across the top there, but mostly leaving that pale patch intact. on the right side I am darkening down this stretch of water because I want to put in a distant bit of land jutting up on the right side, and we would naturally get a little bit of darker colour there reflecting down, which I'm about to do now with a small brush. Found it easier to switch over to just a small round brush here to begin building up a little bit of shape for our distant headland. The paint that I'm using here is basically just a nice murky neutral toned mix of all the dark colours that I currently have on my palette. So it's a bit of Payne's Grey, a bit of Van Dyke Brown and a bit of indigo mixed with plenty of water. I'm keeping my mix quite light and quite watered down to begin with for painting this headland, but because of course if you do happen to make a mistake, it's always easier to lift out lighter paint than it is a very dark and very heavy rich paint. So now that I'm happy with this rough shape, I'm going in with some darker paint. That's a little bit of Van Dyke Brown that I've popped in there, and this is some indigo going in now. And because I've just painted this so it's going in wet and wet, you can see those dark colours actually diffusing into one another, and I'm just popping the indigo here just along the top. I'm going to allow that to diffuse down into the wet paint that's already there, and it's going to give us some really nice sort of natural looking colour and shape in this little rocky headland that could otherwise look like quite a formless, lifeless little blob. So this is a really simple, easy way of just getting a bit of texture into something like this. So now that's completely dry, and as you can see here on this lower left side, I have roughly penciled in the shape of a small boat running against the oncoming storm, and I'm using white gouache here to paint the shape of the boat over these lovely rich dark colours we've got here. So you can see I'm just using the gouache to start building up the shape of the hull here to begin with. Now I know that some people aren't keen on using opaque gouache with watercolour paintings. They like to use just pure watercolour, and if that's your preferred technique, then you can always draw in pencil your little boat to begin with before you put any paint down, then use masking fluid or drawing gum to mask it out, keep it protected, then layer up your wash, your sky and your sea, and then once you remove the masking fluid, of course, your boat shape is there and ready to be painted and to have some little details added in. So that's the other way that you can do this painting. For myself, I decided to wait and see how my seascape ended up looking, where my darks and my lights ended up going in my sea, because I'm never quite certain before time, and that for me would dictate the positioning of how of where I put the boat in. So this is why I'm using the gouache and going over the paint that I've already put in. But luckily the gouache is lovely and opaque, and it will go over these darks, although you will sometimes need a couple of coats if your darks are very, very dark. Here you can see I've switched to a very fine brush to begin putting in the mast and sail details. This is a fine detail brush from Pro Arte size 2/0, so it's nice and small and fine for this kind of work. Now I'm not going to be adding too much detail onto this boat. I want to keep it nice and white and crisp, but I couldn't resist adding a little stripe of red just down the side of the hull there. I think it's a lovely colour and it really pops against the rest of our gloomy, stormy sky. This is light red that I've used, which is a really wonderful and versatile colour. As you can see here, I'm just layering up the white gouache on those sails. You can see it's dried a little lighter than it originally went on. We've still got some dark sea colour peeping through, So it's just a simple matter of adding another layer until you're happy with the opacity. So here you can see I'm just going to build up a little bit of detail just at the back of the boat here and around the sails. I'm going to try and do this really loosely because it is quite a small boat, so I don't want it to get bogged down in detail. So just a few loose marks here with the white, and then using some nice dark indigo to give a little bit of definition onto those white sails. Now, as most of you can probably guess, I am not somebody who knows a great deal about boats. I like to admire them from afar, but I don't tend to get up close and personal, so to speak. So to paint this lovely little boat in, I'm using a reference photo that I found on the website pixabay.com, which I can highly recommend for anyone looking to add these sorts of details into their paintings. Because of this, I am trying to keep the detail that I'm adding into this boat to a basic minimum, partly because it's going to make my painting a bit easier, partly because, of course, with loose painting, the joy is in the sort of suggestion of shapes rather than too much heavy detail worked in, and partly because I don't want to get it wrong. So to do the rigging, or a little bit of rigging at least, I'm using a fine liner pen. This is very, very fine, size 005, a Pigma Micron pen, which I love to use because their ink is fully waterproof and fully archival, so it's fade proof as well. It will last as long as your painting lasts. And you can see here I'm able to just add a couple of really extra fine little lines around the sail to just help finish that off, that I don't think I'd be able to get that lovely fineness with my brush. So that's a handy little trick to use if you want to get these really fine lines in, and if you don't trust your brush point, or if you don't trust your wobbly hand to get those lines fine enough. I'm also adding some nice white water around the boat, using again the white gouache, and I'm sort of putting it in quite sort of scrubbily, almost dry brushing it over this darker water to just get that sense of the water being churned up by the motion of the boat as it ploughs through these rough seas, sending up spray both before it and behind it. And now, just for a final finishing touch, I'm just adding in a couple of high-flying seabirds, just flying ahead of the storm up there. So just a couple of very simple silhouettes, again using my fine brush and some indigo, because it's a lovely dark colour and I still have plenty of it on my palette. And so here we are, this is the finished painting. Thank you very much everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I certainly enjoyed bringing this painting to life. There is something that's just so hugely fun about painting these big dramatic seas and skies that I very heartily recommend that you give this one a go. For those of you who'd like to see some more watercolour tutorials from me, you can follow the link below to my Patreon page, where I've got plenty of other similar tutorials ready and waiting for you. For those of you who've already followed the link and signed up, a huge thank you and welcome. I hope you enjoy the content there, and I hope you enjoyed this video. But for now, that's all from me, so I wish you a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are, and I wish you very happy painting. Until the next time.